So there was a few months ago, we've been in this project for the last, actually almost a year and a half, where we have been migrating a very old kind of system that was built originally in JSPs that then got partially migrated to AngularJS, which we're now partially migrating to TypeScript. And so I'm on the team that we're in the process of doing all the tooling and everything for TypeScript. We're just about ready to have the rest of the developers move their code over from AngularJS into TypeScript. And as we were writing some of these tests, I was rewriting these testing files and realizing that there's so much of what we were doing that was just painful. Where I've got this data piece right here that is for a specific section of the app, that it can be reused everywhere, but a lot of the times the actual unit tests that are being written in JavaScript is just printing that out as pure JSON and then just putting it in. It might even be multiple styles of JSON in the same file for the same object type. They're just putting in parts of it, and then people were, and when I say people, I mean myself included, we were all doing stuff like mocking private functions and doing that kind of coding because it makes it easier. And we talked ourselves into it by saying, hey, you know what, when we mock this private function, what we're actually testing every piece of my code, right? I've got a unit test that tests every single function inside of my code, where if I want a function that, if I have a private function that does this complex piece of logic, I've got 5 unit tests that test that one private function to make certain that logic works correctly. And we did this probably for the last 2 years. And then about a few months ago, I was working on a side project, and I was just in a different language. And there isn't this beautiful, wonderful thing in other languages where I can just type something as any and get access to its private functions, right? And so I went ahead and I was trying to figure out how to do some of these testing. So I called up, I have an identical twin, so he lives in Seattle, works for Qualtrics. So I called him up and asked him, what should I do? How should I do this? How do I write tests like this? Because that's one of his core things at Qualtrics. And he talked to me about a pattern that we have started to follow at my company. So, and we'll start with this just because I am self-taught. And so every single time I read this, it makes me remember how much pain it was for other people to read my code as time has gone on. And it's gotten a lot better since the early days, but still, I went to school, got a marketing degree, and then hated my life for a year, and then decided just to switch. And so I had some friends who gave me a lot of really good chances and some opportunities. So a lot of what we look at when we are testing our code in JavaScript, I don't see this as much in some other languages. I just see code that's not tested in a lot of other languages. But in JavaScript, we get this feeling like, hey, we can test everything because everything's accessible. So one question about how you want to test is whether or not you're testing what your code does versus how it does what it does. Because a lot of times when we were testing, we weren't testing what our code actually did. We were testing how it did that. So we were mocking private methods. We were looking at, hey, are methods being called in a very specific order? Now, this does not, talk about, your service calls or stuff like that, stuff that's external to the class you're testing. But for the inside of the class, are we checking for the order of how stuff works? Do we ever have issues where we change the name of a private method and it breaks something, right? Do we ever have something where we change not what the output of our methods are, but we change some of the internals of how it does that, and that breaks the actual test that we have written. And then also, that led us to think about, could we test what our code actually does? Instead of how it does what it does, could we test just what it does? And so when we worked on this was some of the items that we came up with, where we test only the public methods. Now, maybe some of you, and hopefully all of you guys, are doing the right way and testing only the public functions inside of your TypeScript and JavaScript code. But I saw it as so many people that I've seen it happen a ton. But Angular is really helpful for us in this case, because a lot of times with this pattern, you want to create a fixture because you want to have something that sets up the class you are testing into a testable way, so any dependencies get injected. Angular handles all that for us. We don't have to worry about it, and it's just fantastic in that regards. But what I want to talk about today, what I want to spend the majority of the time, is just on these builder classes. So a builder class is something that says, hey, I've got some piece of data that I pass around my app, and it's some piece of the data model, and what it does is that it a builder class allows me to have both a default form of that data, as well as data that is, hey, this is required. Sorry, these fields are not required, but here's an easy way that's expressive inside of your test to set that data. And then it can help us a lot with code coverage, because then what we can do is, let's say we have a class that has a single public method. We end up with maybe 10 to 15 private methods. We can verify all of those are being hit by the different tests using our code coverage. So as far as what a builder is, this is very simple. It just creates a valid instance of your interface, has a default state, and then uses method chaining for setting of data so that you can set all the data in a fluent manner. Okay, that's enough talking. I really don't like doing the presentation part as much as I like doing the code part. So what I want to, and of course, things don't quite work out the way I want to. So what I kind of want to focus on, and let me see if I can, the screen's a little bit bigger than I thought it would be, so that's excellent. All right, so I'm in the wrong project, of course. Welcome to our, to how Macs work. But, okay, so what I want to show as far as a test is this class. Now, I knocked this out kind of today, but it was primarily because what I did is I just took a class that we had written already in another language, and we just copied it into this language, into TypeScript. Now, what this class does is that it takes in two different things, hours and tasks, and it converts them into a different data model. It just transforms the data into a data model that is where projects are at the top, and then tasks, and then hours. Instead of having a task and hours, we can actually transform that data into a single data model. And it does not make sense in this case to have more than one public method that just says, hey, I want to transform this piece of data, and I want to convert it into the right format and verify that it's the right format. So when I was writing tests originally, this is very similar to a test that I wrote specifically for this code, is that I said, okay, I'm going to write a test that actually tests this private method, sort tasks by project and portfolio. It's, again, I just more to this, but and you'll see that, of course, I mean, not of course, but I am using Jest because we love it. Thanks to the last Angular meetup I came to, which was, I think, in July. It's revolutionized the way we do testing. But you'll see that what I'm actually testing here is I'm testing that given some data that gets returned, right? I get specific methods being called. I get them called 4 times, and I want to make certain that they got called with the correct data, and that's all that I'm testing, right? Now, what's good about this is that I'm testing exactly what my code does. Because if we look at the actual code itself, it's very simple. And it just says, hey, I want to make certain that I got in some tasks, some hours, I passed in some data, and then what came out the other end was the thing that I wanted. The problem with this is let's say that I were to change just the method name here. Not any functionality, just the method name, because this method name doesn't really make sense in this context. Well, that would break all of my tests across the board. Also, let's say that this method itself, it ended up making a slight change to this method that wasn't really tested in another area of my code, right? Well, if it wasn't tested very well by another unit test, then what could end up happening is that I could change something internal here and have this method that actually calls its parent method, but this method isn't failing. What ends up happening is I've broken my code and I don't have adequate testing that can actually show that my code has changed in any way. And we've had this happen all the time in production, where we say, hey, something goes out live, and the unit tests that were testing the code did not actually test its functionality. That has tested its implementation, how it did it. And so someone added some new how, and no one actually tested what it does. Did it actually change what the methods did? And so if we look at this method, what I want to show now is I want to show, let's redo some of these tests in a more fluent manner. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you these builder classes that were being created. So This is just a very, very simple builder class. And what it does is that it generates out just a basic task that has an ID, a name, and a project, right? And then we use these fluent methods so that we can chain the method calls together, which makes it a lot easier, especially when you're doing things into arrays and a lot of other stuff, to build it out in a more kind of fluent and obvious manner for that. And then we have this build function, which again, I'll show another example where you don't use this. It just comes down to what specifically you want, but this just returns an item of a specific type. And it actually calls the build function on any of its children. So if we were to come back to our testing file here, and we were to call this, and we were to say, all right, so what we want is that we want to make certain that tasks get nested underneath their project. So we say, hey, I want an array of tasks. And I can just call my builder method, and I'm going to initialize this. And what this method does is that it just gives me an instance. You could do the whole new syntax, completely up to you. That's not anything. So, but I say, hey, I want to have, and I have this helper method called with IDs. And this is one of the powerful aspects of builders, is let's say that you've got a piece of code that you're constantly changing, a piece of the data model you constantly want to tweak, and it's actually multiple pieces at the same time. You can write a helper method that does this. And this is one area where I'm like, I want to modify both the task ID and the project ID at the same time, because I don't want to have a with project ID, with task ID. And so I can create a helper method that helps me with this. So I just say, hey, I want to have a task ID of 1, and I want a project ID of 1. I'm just going to call build here. Now I'm going to copy this out a little bit. And I'm just going to say, hey, I'm going to come down here. All right, so now let's say that I want to test this. Now I'm going to use some jest magic, just because it will save us a lot of time on this. But you can do this however you feel is needed for your project. But anyway, so. Now, in like Jasmine, you would probably have to write something where you were saying, hey, I want to make certain that, that it matches this particular format. Or another way you can do it is that it's an array. That way it comes out the other end as an array containing this path of arrays and objects. And just check just the IDs, not the rest of the data with it. But because we're in jest and we can use the snapshots, I want to run this again. Now this will probably fail because I think I had run this before and the snapshot was incorrect. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just update that snapshot. Now, what's good about this is that let's say that, sorry, as far as the test goes, all that you see is you just see, hey, I want to make certain that this looks the right way. And if we were to look at the actual snapshot itself, right, we can see that, hey, I've got a project with a project ID of 1 and a task ID, and then I've got project ID, task ID, and it just goes down, right? Exactly what we would want to have happen, right? Where we have these projects, they all need to have their tasks that are inside of them. And so this is a really simple kind of an instance for this. So now let's say that we were to do another one, which makes certain that the hours are attached to both a project and a task. So I'm going to copy this up here. And then I'm going to create a new array for hours. There we go. Okay, hold on one second. Sorry, I always love it when IntelliSense fails you. All right, well, it's failed me. So anyways, okay. So, Aaron, thank you. That's awesome. It's always those little things when you're doing presentations that get you. All right, so I can specify this, that it's got an ID of, hour ID 1, but then I can also specify that I want to make certain that it's got a project ID. Right? But then there are a couple of different items where we can't have stuff that's inside of a task. Okay, and what will end up happening here, and I could continue, but we have, what I'm testing right here is I'm testing two completely different pieces of functionality. That if an hour, which is completely separate in the data model from the project and task, comes in having been specified with a specific project and a task, then it goes onto that task. But if it gets specified with no task, but just a project, it gets created and attached to at the project level, not at the task level, right? And that's all being tested with just this little bit of code. So then if I say, hey, I want to expect this, and this is, of course, I think going to fail too, just because, again, I had run all of these before and then delete this other side of them. But so let's go look at this, and this is what's important about snapshots, is to go look at it. But we can see that the actual inside of our project with ID of 1, there's an hours here, and there's an hour inside of the task itself. Okay? So, and this is a little bit of a problem just because I had some extra code in there. But now this is all really kind of cool. And I hope that you guys can see from this, and this is actually where I made a mistake, but I hope you can see from this that there's a little bit that this should be able to help you, especially with more complex data models, to create something that is hopefully testable, that if I have another unit test that uses the same data model or the same pieces of the data model, that it can actually just use the same builder. And then if something changes in my data model, I go to one place, I change that file the way that it works, and it instantly lets me know every single piece of my code and my unit tests that are all broken, right? But if something changes, so like with this code right here, where I'm looking down inside of my code, oops. This one right down here, if I come down here and I'm looking at, oops, this is the wrong one, sorry. If I come down here and I'm looking at where a task, how a task or an hour gets parsed, and I change something in here, that automatically gets reflected into the tests, and it's all of my tests get that reflected into them. So if I add a new feature in, or I add a new variable into what gets output here, so let's say that someone adds a new parameter into hour, right? Or they change hour, a parameter's name or whatever. All of the tests fail. But then I come to my builder class, I alter my builder class after I've altered my, the actual code itself. So once the code has been altered, I go to my builder class, I change it there, everything gets fixed automatically. And you start to see that all of your tests, you can follow that red-green pattern a lot better because you're actually testing the implementation of your code and how it actually is doing this. What it's doing. One thing that so I wanted to show, just the last thing, is a more complex service that we've written in the last couple of weeks. And this is a dumbed down version. There's a little bit more to it that we've added in. But what this does is that we have these services called page services in AngularJS. Okay, and I'm showing you both two transformation versions, but I want you to see there's a lot of instances of use case for this, but these ones help you to see a little bit better. But what it takes in is it takes in this AngularJS page service, and it transforms it into something our left nav in Angular can read. Because we were seeing a lot of problems trying to get these two systems to talk to each other. So we said, screw it. We're going to write it the way that it should be written inside of Angular, inside of TypeScript. And then we're just going to write a transformation layer to take it using a page resolver to take that AngularJS page service and throw it into our left navigation. So this is a somewhat complex piece of stuff. It runs through. It does a bunch of extra code. But the actual thing that I really wanted to highlight is that we wrote a couple of builders specifically around sorry. Let me find this. Yeah. the activated route system inside of Angular. Now the reason we did this is because we were trying to come up with a way for us to easily and quickly change out how the activated route behaved, right? Because there was a lot of times in our testing where the exact path, so let's say that I've got an activated route and it's got a child of this and it's got a child of that. We wanted to be able to test that really simply without having to create a really complex thing that we would pass in as the using dependency injection. So we created this builder class, and then what would happen is that let's need just the init right here gives me a valid activated route. And then the only things that I do is I say, hey, I want to have an activated route with a first child of this, and then that one is an activated route that has a params like this, and then creates a snapshot. Okay? And so the only thing that I actually have to test, even though this is kind of a complex piece of what Angular does, I don't really care how Angular does this. I care that what the data model that's come out that gets passed into my code is of the correct type. So the actual activated route builder inherits or implements the activated route class or the activated route interface. And then what that allows me to do is that allows me to say, hey, this is going to be of the correct type, and you don't have to care about, you just care about changing the one or two things that your code needs to test. But it makes certain that I'm running every method inside of my code, every single test. Anything that's going to be touched by this or needs to be touched by this call, it gets touched and it gets played with, and so when it needs it, it gets that kind of a functionality check. So I don't want to go too much more into this because I know it got a little bit heavy at the end. But any questions about this? Yeah, please. No, please do.
If you go back to the last screen you're on.
Yeah.
What is extends?
So extends, this is an object-oriented thing, and so TypeScript gives us this ability. And what it does is that I've got this base builder class that gives me this funky init. I didn't want to have to repeat this method every single time that I call. So I've got multiple builders, and I want them all to be able to call init, which is basically having them create a new version of themselves. And so it is inheritance is what it is. It's object-oriented inheritance. So I'm inheriting any methods of functionality from this parent class. Anyone else? Okay. So I just want to highlight one of the things that's been really helpful for us, again, is this has been probably one of the key aspects for Angular. And I would not recommend, don't get me wrong, I would not recommend you go out and rewrite a bunch of builders for every single piece of Angular. But we have to play with the activated route so freaking much in our code with Angular that for us to have a single place that's implemented in our tests makes it way easier for us to create mocks and create instances for it that we don't have to worry about is it the correct way. And if Angular changes its API, we can change it in one place and then see all the places we have to go and alter that if we need to. All right, that's all I have to say.